Hi, everybody. Welcome in. This is the Collaboratives community session. This session is all about fiscal sponsorship and the future of fiscal sponsorship for collaborative funds. We are so excited to be joined by the Social Impact Commons team. We have Thaddeus and Asta here to share their brilliant wisdom about fiscal sponsorship, the field scan that they recently completed, and some musings on the future for collaborative philanthropy. And we're hoping to make this a really interactive conversation with folks asking questions about their own experiences and thoughts. So really excited to kick this off. As always, we'll be recording the first part of this conversation, which is the more webinar style, and then we'll turn the recording off for the Q&A to keep that more informal. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Thaddeus and Asta. Welcome in, both of you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Isis, and thanks to Philanthropy Together for hosting this. We're really pleased to be here. Hopefully that share was successful. All right.
Yep.
I always have to check, we're particularly happy to talk about collaborative funds in the growing ecosystem as it's coming up more and more for fiscal sponsors, and many sponsors are working across various lines of relationship to philanthropy, from sponsored projects to hosting collaborative funds. So this is a really present topic for us. We're going to do a little bit of introductory information gathering, question gathering from you all, but we've got sort of three acts here. One, first talking about fiscal sponsorship and doing a little level setting. We realize that there are both there's all levels of knowledge in the room. So we're going to try to strike a balance just to make sure that we end up with a good basic knowledge. Asta is going to talk about some of the highlights from our field scan in terms of what's surfacing in the field. And then we have some information to share about thoughts in the sponsor-sponsee relationship, particularly as it pertains to collaborative funds. And so and then finishing with an open discussion and Q&A. Let's see here. Hopefully you all are familiar with some of these technologies. We're using Slido today. You can either use the QR code or go to slido.com and put in the pound code there. But we're interested in just who's in the room in terms of what your model is for how you work. And I believe we have even an option down there for funders who are in the room who are just there as funders of funds. So if we could just get a sense of who's doing what and what your model is, to the extent you have a defined model.
And all you have to do is to go onto the website, slido.com, and put in the number 1384223, or scan this QR code, and it will bring you right there. Thank you, Isis. And we see the results are rolling in. That's the exciting part of the technology. Is we're able to see it right away. So and we see how many people responded.
Give this 30 seconds or so more. We don't need to be encyclopedic. We just want to get a little bit of a sense. All right. So we're seeing a lot of mostly funders at the moment, and a bit of unsurety, which is also something we encounter a lot. So hopefully we can render clarity today about what model is. So thank you for that. Let's go on to our next next poll here, just a second. So this is just open. Again, same QR code and site, but just curious to transcribe some of the big questions you have vis-a-vis fiscal sponsorship and collaborative funds. Questions and pain points. So words and phrases.
And we definitely will discuss some of these topics during conversation today, from fees to what is the legality of it, right? Who owns what, and who has which. What's that power of sharing that both the fiscal sponsor and the project or the collaborative funds have.
So one more person typing, and this is great.
Thank you.
Thank you all. We will keep that. And so finally, as this is our last question, then we're going to dive into our material. So we just talked about questions and pain points, but what do you see as benefits? What is the virtue of using a fiscal sponsor relationship for collaborative funds?
Ease of entry, beautiful.
Yep. Accessibility is a big one. Any others? We're heavy on pain, light on benefit at the moment. Hopefully we can change that. I see a few people typing. We'll just wait a few more seconds here. All right. Expertise, yep. Support team. Support without the hardship of startup. Great. All right. Well, thank you. Good to see, and we will keep these notes in mind as we move through. And thank you for your answers there. So diving right in. As I said, we know most of you are familiar broadly with fiscal sponsorship, so we're going to move fairly quickly through this. If you have questions or comments or things you want to scribe, please put them in the chat, and Asta may be able to address them as we're moving through the material. We'll also have time to kind of answer questions directly as we go. So fiscal sponsorship is broadly an arrangement where a charity, usually a 501c3, assumes responsibility, fiduciary control and responsibility over charitable funds on behalf of an otherwise independent charitable activity or mission. And there are multiple models. There's 6 or 7, depending on how you count. But unlike a traditional nonprofit with multiple programs, the project may exit, and that's part of the front-end agreement with the sponsor. That's one of the big differences between, say, a fiscally sponsored project and just a program of a garden variety nonprofit. And it is also a co-management relationship. There's much more independence and autonomy afforded to the sponsored project than, say, would be typical of a program within a single mission organization. Couple notes on language. As you just heard me say, talked about the project. And so these are not legal terms. These are terms of art for the field, but we generally talk about the activity that's being supported or sponsored as the project. The person connected to that activity that has authority to instruct the sponsor is the project director. That's a generic term. That person may have other titles publicly. And then model refers to a taxonomy of fiscal sponsorship models that was put together by attorney Greg Colvin in the 90s that letters them alphabetically, and we'll be talking about 3 of them today that are the most, 2 of them are the most prevalent, and one is one that might be of particular interest to collaborative funds. So diving into kind of Colvin's list of models here, model C, we'll start with, we're not going to go in alphabetical order. Model C is perhaps the most widely known. Publicly, this is the pre-approved grant model. It is essentially a re-granting construct where a funder or a donor grants or gives money to the sponsor, the charity, who has then essentially a re-granting agreement with, and it's often an individual or a non-exempt entity, could be an LLC or an S Corp, and that individual or entity carries out the charitable activity with those funds under their fiscal sponsorship agreement with the sponsor. So funds are re-granted down. Reports are sent back up to the sponsor and the funder. So it's a sort of three-way arrangement. And significantly, the non-exempt entity or person is doing all of the insuring, paying. They are the kind of holder of that charitable activity, as well as which includes both income and liabilities. One thing we like to point out with Model C is that when that charitable money gets re-granted from the sponsor to the individual or non-exempt entity, it becomes taxable. And so even though this is a very common or popular model, it does represent some risk and challenges for the sponsored project because what was once tax exempt becomes normative income for that non-exempt entity. In this relationship, the sponsor retains fiduciary control. So the question about control or ownership, the sponsor has to kind of retain that fiduciary control. It's called variance power, and that's usually included in the sponsorship agreement as an explicit clause. And that allows that money to remain charitable, to satisfy qualified distribution requirements for the funder or tax deductibility for an individual donor. And this is essentially the mechanism of Model C, pre-approved grant. Some people falsely call this the pass-through model. As many of you may know, that's a no-no for the IRS. We don't pass through charitable funds. The workaround for that really is the re-granting construct and the variance power and control that the sponsor holds over those charitable funds. And they retain that ultimate responsibility for reporting and accountability to the funder. Model A, which is also known as comprehensive fiscal sponsorship, is a little less well-known, but equally common in the fiscal sponsorship field. A and C are far and away the most prevalent models. In this model, the project is in-house, essentially no different than a program of the sponsor charity. But the agreement between the project and the sponsor is often with an unincorporated association or another entity. It could be a nonprofit that is seeking its tax status and doesn't have a letter yet, or it could be a taxable entity like an LLC. But the activity, all of the revenue, all of the expense is contained within the sponsor. So that includes employment matters, that includes contracting. Essentially, the sponsor becomes the de facto legal representative of the project because all transactions are with the sponsor, not another entity. So this is an all-in model where essentially the project benefits from a shared back office that is held by the sponsor. So you're getting finance, accounting, HR, legal, often insurances, general liability, and D&O are baked into this model. And you have to kind of take advantage of all of it or nothing. There's very little cherry picking in terms of those basic services, because as you can imagine, if the sponsor is holding all of the liabilities for the project on their behalf, they have to insure them and they have to do all this other work, including compliance. In this case, the sponsor is doing all of the compliance for that activity, and there's no other entity that has compliance responsibility. So it's a very efficient model, and we like to look at this as essentially a shared or cooperative back office, comprehensive back office for charitable projects. I will also note that we advocate strongly for Model A as a forever solution for nonprofits. We actually advocate against the drive to go and stand alone as nonprofits out there. As we know, there are 1.8 million nonprofits and counting, and most of them very small. And with the presence of Model A as a comprehensive solution, we frankly do not see the need, except in rare cases, for standalone nonprofit formation. I know that's a provocative statement probably to present company, but that is something we see more and more Model A being used for, particularly amongst younger generations of nonprofit entrepreneurs. And they see this as their forever home, wherein they can grow. I want to mention, just because of the particular topic today and focus on collaborative funds, there is a Model AL, sometimes called just Model L, fiscal sponsorship, which is all of the services and shared resources of Model A. But instead of the project just being a program inside the sponsor proper, it sits inside a subsidiary wholly owned LLC that is charitably exempt per force of the sole member relationship with the sponsor. So the LLC doesn't have to go to the IRS and seek tax status. It becomes automatically a 501c3 the moment it has a sole member relationship with a 501c3. And it is disregarded with regard to the IRS. So it gets rolled up into the parent's 990 once a year in that reporting cycle, and is just scheduled on the back. So you get the same efficiencies of compliance and shared management you do with Model A, but you have a little legal separation. And this model gets used for projects where there are complex assets that they want to contain in a standalone entity, and not have necessarily commingled directly with the sponsor's assets. This is used to kind of segregate liability and risk a little bit. You get some of that protection between LLC, that LLCs afford their parent. It also, and this may be the utility for collaborative funds, it provides greater portability. So because that LLC has its own bank accounts, its own EIN, et cetera, and all the systems and staff related to it are contained often in the LLC, when the project spins out, it's simply about changing ownership of the LLC. You don't have to pull the assets out or unplug all the plugs and replug them in somewhere else. You're just moving the entire entity to either another charitable sole member owner or off onto its own as its own nonprofit. So this is a variant of A with some more benefits and options in terms of how you structure employee-employer relationships, benefits, insurance, and as I said, portability is one of the main reasons folks reach for this model. But otherwise, it is very similar to A. And of course, all the income and expense goes to the subsidiary, not the sponsor. One last thing I'll note that may be of interest to you all is that the project, the LLC, can raise money in its own name without referencing the sponsor's name, as is the case with Model A. And that has some relational and sort of public image benefits depending on what the agenda is and the goals are of the organization. So you use the parent's tax letter when you need to demonstrate tax deductibility, but you can raise money in a totally separate name, whatever that name of the LLC is. So very, very briefly, there are some subtleties in the spectrum of these structures. So Model C fiscal sponsorship, as we mentioned, is a regranting relationship, and that's a very common relationship in the nonprofit sector. There are alliances and trade associations that do regranting all the time, and they don't call it fiscal sponsorship. Generally, if a funder is writing a grant to an intermediary organization and that grant is being essentially subject to a separate RFP, there's not a predetermined end recipient for that money, then it's just general regranting. You're allowing that intermediary to undertake a separate grant-making process with regard to those funds. That's regranting. If there is a designated end recipient for the money that you're giving to the intermediary, then it probably is Model C fiscal sponsorship. That's the real difference between the two. There's usually not a subsequent RFP in a Model C relationship. So that's the difference. We get that question a lot between regranting and Model C. Model A, we often get the question, what's the difference between that and just any program of nonprofit? And as I said, the main differences are the program or the project enjoys much greater brand and identity separation. They can behave to the outside world as though they are on their own. They have much greater autonomy and decision-making over a lot of their key strategic and day-to-day activities. And they also can exit, which is not something you could say of a program within any nonprofit. The head of education at the art museum can't just wake up tomorrow and say, I want to leave and take my team with me. You can do that as a fiscally sponsored project. That's the big difference. Cost, since there were lots of questions about cost, and the first comment in was the fees are too high. So let's talk about cost. We're going to leave this chart for you all to peruse subsequently. I'm not going to go through all these kind of division of labor details. This is just sort of a side-by-side in terms of what happens differently standalone versus AL or Model C. But across the top is what we want to focus on here. These are the average cost allocations or general cost allocations for the field that we have recorded. These are not necessarily new. These have been pretty consistent over time. A or AL tends to range 10 to 15% of revenue. Most fiscal sponsor models are assessed against revenue, although some are against expense, but the majority are against the revenue. Model C tends to range between 4 and 8% of revenue. The difference there, of course, is a substantive difference in services and actual work that is being done or responsibility that is being taken by the sponsor. We often find donors and funders finding even the Model C rates to be too high, and like to remind folks that the sponsor is taking full fiduciary responsibility for those funds. It is impacting their annual compliance and compliance costs. We see a lot of sponsor orgs being pushed into higher levels of compliance need because of fiscally sponsored funds they receive. So even though it seems like an easy pass-through, there is a lot of work and responsibility borne by the sponsor in these relationships. Obviously, with Model A, there's a lot of direct administrative work, a lot more going along with it. We did a comparative cost analysis looking at an arts and culture sample because we have very deep data through data arts on that ecosystem. And we found that essentially the cost differentials as a percent of revenue for the same things that A or AL provides cost a standalone organization in that cohort we studied between 17 and 27% of revenue. So about a 10% difference in cost. And so with these models, there's a lot of value being delivered in terms of the services and support, and it's still in our analysis is a cheaper and more efficient solution than standing alone as a nonprofit because you get all those economies of scale. In Model A, you're doing 1 990, not 100 990s. You have a lot of costs that are distributed, and that makes it much more efficient and cost effective from a funding standpoint. This is just a side-by-side of just the core services. So Model C, as you can see, is more limited. It's just dealing with the contributed income, whereas Model A is really a full operating model. All income, all expense is being managed through the sponsor. And so with that comes a much more robust list of services. Why fiscal sponsorship? We hear, and these should be probably familiar to present company, equitable access, somebody mentioned that in terms of collaborative funds. Certainly having much more ready, fluid access to nonprofit infrastructure is a major benefit that we hear often. Efficiency, as I just mentioned, from a financial standpoint, as well as operating standpoint, it's also big. We see more and more sponsors today growing as solidarity economy type structures. So sponsors that are being developed, led, and benefiting particular communities of identity or particular geographies. So solidarity economy, equity, and justice are really central in the field. And in that line, we see Model A really being used essentially like a management cooperative for multiple independent nonprofits. That's another way of looking at Model A. And in that, you get values of power sharing, peer governance, and cultural competency and capacities that might be specific to a group or a community that are really valuable and essential today. And finally, from a philanthropy standpoint, certainly compliance and good hygiene as a charity are one of the big benefits we see sponsors providing. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this slide. You'll have it in the deck. This is just the sort of analysis we did, a little bit more detail on that cost analysis between standalone and Model A. The numbers were pretty eye-opening. That 10% difference in cost overall really amounted to a 50% difference in total overhead as a percent of budget for that cohort. And this was 475 organizations operating below $2 million that we looked at in southeastern Pennsylvania. So to close this section, and I'll turn it over to Asta to talk about the field scan, we really see an evolution of the field afoot at the moment, where Model A, the comprehensive fiscal sponsorship form, is, as I just mentioned, being seen as a place of reimagination and reinvention in terms of power relationships. And this, I think, could speak directly to trust-based philanthropy and community-centric grant making that is one of the core, we know to be one of the core drivers behind the collaborative fund movement. So within Model A, you can have a project and it can have its own steering committee, its own bylaws, its own ways of making decisions about that money that are distinct from, say, the sponsor, but allow the funds to be stewarded in a way that the group of funders or donors desire. And so we're calling this sort of management commons, which is really, as I said, a sort of looking at this as essentially a cooperatized or commonized nonprofit infrastructure solution. And we apply in our work commoning values from that field of practice. And the big ones that we bring to that are really clarity of the resources that are being shared, how they're being shared, what the costs are, being very transparent about that, an investment in intentional community building and learning, and finally, a commitment to peer governance. And I think peer governance really is baked into the collaborative fund model. It's almost the de facto reason it exists, because you've got a group of funders who want to get together to address a particular problem, an opportunity on the landscape. We really think that management commons is kind of a ripe framework for collaborative funds to think about. So pause for just a sec. And that was a lot very quickly, we realize, but want to just check in, see how we're doing, and if there are any burning questions before we dive into the field scan. I'm looking for my...
So Thaddeus, the core question that came in was really about why do we recommend nonprofits not to launch their own independent structures, and I think we've summed it up. The reasons why is really because of a first, cost efficiencies that you gain by sharing infrastructure with others. Second, it's the additional resources that you might, that especially smaller nonprofits have access through fiscal sponsorship that otherwise they might not be able to afford, or they would have to look for in-kind or volunteer supports in that area. And third, it's really about it's really about solidarity economy and ensuring that together you are actually stronger than independently. And a great example of that was a PPP, for example, where during COVID times, through fiscal sponsorship relationships, a large number of very small nonprofits were able to access the funds without moving a finger, because fiscal sponsor really played the role in requesting those PPP funds, and it was one application rather than 100 or 200 applications into the government asking for funds. So that's just one of the examples, but we have lots of others. And what we see, especially for the smaller nonprofits, that and especially the ones that might be facing the leadership crisis and funding crisis, they really see a huge benefit in sharing the infrastructure instead.
Yeah, and I'll just add that this is a bit of, I've spent 25 years in the sector, mostly working with smaller organizations, below the $5 million kind of threshold. And Aside from the comparative analysis, there's no panacea to sustainability in our sector. Certainly, there's no silver bullet or easy answer, but I believe and have witnessed firsthand that there is greater resilience, and I would give an organization under a Model A sponsor more chances of survival and weathering the bumps in the road than an organization standing alone out on the landscape. I also happen to believe that we've adopted essentially a private asset management model for the nonprofit sector, and its assets are totally different than the private sector. They are public trust. And so we don't need to enclose or sort of legally sequester as much as we do. Certainly we need to do some of that, but seeing fiscal sponsors now being a good 10 plus years in the field, certainly things can go wrong in the sponsor-sponsee relationship, and nothing's going to be perfect. But I think I would feel that our nonprofit landscape, or bet that it's a lot more resilient if we collectivized the infrastructure to a greater degree than we currently are, because there is safety in numbers and there's resilience in those economies of scale. So this is really a broad kind of alternative hypothesis for how we've built the nonprofit sector writ large, which I think I would like us to see the reverse, where standalone is more the exception and more collective infrastructure is the rule. I don't see how we individually capacitate otherwise 1.8 million and counting little charities. I don't see that as a feasible program for our sector. So that's me being a little bit more provocative, but that's that's why we do what we do. So Asta.
So given the time and a few more slides that we have to cover, and the fact that safety is in numbers, one of the most common questions that we get asked is, well, how many fiscal sponsors are there? We've just about a year ago, we have done a field scan of fiscal sponsorship community, and a full 100 fiscal sponsors responded. Together, they reported that they supported a total of over 12,000 charitable projects, and they managed over $2.6 billion in sponsored funds. What was always so interesting for us is how big of a value was of the government-funded projects, over $575 million, and altogether across this 100 organizations, they supported and employed 18,000 staff and/or consultants, and accepted on behalf of the projects over $700 million in individual contributed funds. So to answer the question of how many fiscal sponsors are there in the community, this only is a representation of 100 fiscal sponsors that responded. We estimate that when we look at the Candid database, when we do a bit of a search, because at the moment there is no other way to identify which of the organizations are providing fiscal sponsorship services and or supports, we are able to come up with around over almost 600 fiscal sponsors that are referencing themselves or identifying themselves as such. And when we look, but we expect that actually at the moment, more closer to 5,000 fiscal sponsors, organizations currently provide fiscal sponsorship supports. So in the long run, working with Candid, we hope to answer this question of how many organizations actually do provide shared infrastructure. And I hope in the next couple of years, we'll be able to do that. Next slide. But what did we learn from the field scan? What we learned is that overall, just as our hunch has been over the last 23 years, starting with the year of 2000, we actually have seen a very high increase in the number of organizations that are offering fiscal sponsorship supports. So 73% of all of the respondents, or otherwise 73 of the respondents, actually started fiscal sponsorship program at or after the year of 2000. And we have had one other field scan done in 2006. So we were able to compare a little bit of the data and what we were able to reference is that the fiscal sponsorship programs have grown tremendously in the size, as you see from the graph on the right side. In 2006, majority of the initiatives were very small or small, so having less than 30 projects, less than 30 organizations actually had 30 or more projects within their portfolio, while at the moment we've seen a huge increase in the growth and the size of the fiscal sponsorship communities. But beyond the growth and the size of the portfolios, we also, next slide, we also have seen a growth in the type of intentionality of these programs. One of the examples was, what geography do you cover? And what we've seen is that the largest growth in the number of fiscal sponsorship programs were actually around local focus, local shared infrastructure providers and regional shared infrastructure providers, as well as international organizations. Still, when you compare out of the 100 fiscal sponsors that responded to this, only 8 or 9 of them were suggesting that they're offering international fiscal sponsorship focus supports, and we hope to see a continuous growth in all of these areas, local, regional, and international, in the years to come. But beyond that, there are a couple other pieces of interest that we thought it would be interesting to highlight with you today. One is most of the fiscal sponsors responded that they actually provide a lot more supports beyond this traditional accounts payables, accounts receivables, and the grant making supports. Over 50% of them actually responded that they offer fundraising support, that they offer capacity building supports, and they offer organizational development supports and a lot more financial planning analysis, strategic financial planning and analysis supports. Beyond that, what was also interesting for us is because we always think that a fiscal sponsor is just doing fiscal sponsorship, right? But actually from what came out from the field scan is that over 70% of all of the respondents offer shared infrastructure to their communities that they serve. And on top of that, they also offer lots of other number of other different programming. So all of this is to say and support that any independent nonprofit can also offer shared infrastructure supports. And that's what we want to see and encourage nonprofits infrastructure in nonprofit structures to do. Beyond that, we also have noticed that from the field scan that we have most of the fiscal sponsors actually support very diverse communities. We actually, in the field scan, we actually have utilized candidates DIA questions. So therefore, we were able to compare an average nonprofit DIA data set that was reported through Candid with the respondents to the field scan. And what we have noticed is that from the 50% of the field scan respondents, it became very clear that overall fiscal sponsors offer a greater diversity, have greater diversity in project leadership, as well as board constituency, as well as and a little bit as well as senior staff levels in comparison to the average nonprofits that responded to DIA requested questions with Candid. And then we also had a question asked about collaborative funds and donor advised funds. How many fiscal sponsors are actually providing supports to these two audiences and to these two efforts? And what we've seen is around 50%, over 47, actually provided, and also beyond fiscal sponsorship services, they also offered support to donor collaboratives as well as donor advised funds. There about 30 respondents actually said that they offer donor and funder collaborative supports, which was of interest for us. And then when we looked into deeper, because we said, okay, well, let's be curious about this, what this data tells us a little bit more. And if you go to the next slide, that is, one of the things that came out of this is that donor collaborative supports actually are more, and funder collaborative supports are much more offered by larger fiscal sponsors than smaller fiscal sponsors. So if you look at this data set that is shared in this graph, what we're looking at is that the areas of green and blue are the ones that are larger or medium-sized fiscal sponsors. So fiscal sponsors that are $10 million and above are more commonly offering funder collaboratives and donor advised funds related supports. And you probably have, so we didn't ask a question today as to, for those that might be fiscally sponsored at the moment, who is your fiscal sponsor? But we notice, we have seen a trend where donor collaboratives tend to be focused and transitioning to and utilizing larger fiscal sponsor support. And we hope in the long run that trend will change. The other aspect that came out very clearly from the field scan is that we have that most of the field scan respondents reference that they have a really high demand for the supports. So hence, if you are noticing that your fiscal sponsor might not be meeting all of your needs or might have a difficulty answering some of your questions, it's probably because they have a pretty, and that's what the data reference, that they might have a need for more internal, to build more internal capacity to be able to support the portfolio that they have. They reference that at least 25% of all the fiscal sponsors reference even that they are planning to stop accepting new projects because of the high intensity and high demand, and the fact that they need more efforts to build internally before they are able to serve more projects.
All right. Thank you.
So I wonder if there are any questions around the field scan data. I see that is there are lots of questions coming up, but are there questions specifically to the field scan that also leverage and highlight?
You can either chat or just come off mute if there's any questions. So Mark asks, how are budgets secured under fiscal sponsorships? So when you say secured, do you mean defined or drafted, or just curious for a little bit more context? I can describe this. Typically the project, and often projects will have an advisory. Oh, so it doesn't get gobbled up. I got you. Well, a lot of time when there are disputes between over assets between sponsor and project is because there's not a good fiscal sponsorship agreement in place. So there's been a handshake or a less than desirable degree of definition and formality to the relationship. So in a good fiscal sponsorship relationship, there's a clear agreement between project and sponsor. And any funds that are granted or generated by that project are fully restricted to the project. And so as a grant maker, if you want to essentially give an unrestricted grant to the project, so it's unrestricted within the project, it still has to be restricted in the primary grantor grantee agreement to that project, so that there is no unclarity about the purpose of those funds, and the sponsor can't say, well, those are our funds, we're going to do with them as we please, or we're going to claw them back. So you need a good fiscal sponsorship agreement, and you need to make sure that the underlying grant agreements from the primary funder make that restriction to the project. because essentially all sponsored projects are permanently restricted funds and managed as such internally within the organization. I shouldn't say permanently restricted. I know that's an accounting term for endowments, but they are fully restricted funds within the sponsors. So they shouldn't be commingling. They shouldn't be begging and borrowing from their projects. That's bad fiscal sponsorship or poorly constructed fiscal sponsorship. We do have templates. We have a set of templates for all the various models. And we do a lot of work with, ASTA does a lot of work, I shouldn't say we, it's ASTA doing a lot of work with the finance departments of the sponsors we work with to make sure that their practices are in line with fulfilling those restrictions and making sure that funds remain clearly designated to the project. Great question, though.
And we do have, in the long run, if you want a template of a agreement, we have created agreement templates for both Model A and Model C relationships that are utilizing simple language and kind of sets the expectation of all different aspects that you want to cover, from IP language to fund management language to other aspects of what, and creating clarity of what is truly co-shared and co-shared responsibility, and what are other responsibilities that both the project holds versus the fiscal sponsor holds as well. That is, yep.
Yeah, well, we just have a few more. When we were talking about this session, we wanted to focus on sort of the sponsor-sponsee relationship vis-a-vis collaborative funds. So we do have a few bits of a few slides on that topic, but wanted to make sure we had the space for clearing up questions and such first. But these key bullets, these 6 bullets here, are really what we look for as essential elements in any fiscal sponsorship agreement, regardless of model. This is for all of them. Obviously, clear parties, knowing what model you're getting into and what services and supports it indicates, as we were discussing. The rate should be clear. Is it assessed on revenue and expense? What's the percent? IP is an important piece of that equation. Variance power, as I mentioned, is a key. There's various ways you can express that legally, from formal to informal, but it's got to be there somewhere, as well as the exit terms for the project. Those are the key things that this is actually what we present to funders as things for them to look for in the sponsorship agreement when they're thinking about making a grant to a fiscally sponsored project. This is just kind of basic due diligence. I can move forward with some of these other slides, but want to make sure we hold space for any questions on the material we've covered. And we do want to leave a few minutes just to talk about sort of next steps. There was a question about what do smaller fiscal sponsors need to do to be able to be stewards of collaborative funds? Great question. That is the question for today, I think. Because we see, as Asta pointed out, most of collaborative funds are going to the largest fiscal sponsors. And that is not, there's nothing wrong with that. Those sponsors, I'm sure, are very fine at what they do. But if we're thinking deeply about equity and justice and distributing funds to places where they haven't been before, a lot of the smaller and mid-size, more either identity-specific or region geography-specific fiscal sponsors really could benefit from the collective, could benefit economically and otherwise from hosting those kinds of funds. So we'd like to see, if you will, the wealth spread around a little bit more, and that is a win-win. It gains capacity for those sponsors. It's a way to help them up because there is some income that comes with that, of course, from the cost allocations. But it's also a way of developing and distributing relationships further out into the community and not consolidating them. So we would like to see and like to develop some guidelines for sponsors specific to collaborative funds. And so we'd love to hear from you what you think. What are the key things you really are looking for as funders when looking at a sponsor relationship, and what are the supports you need and such? Because we think this is a really underdeveloped area in sponsorship practice, and it needs a lot of attention. Yes, and Isis pointed out, we did provide some very light guidance to Bridgespan in terms of just sussing out how many funds are being managed under a sponsorship relationship versus some of the other models, like DAFs or just standalone nonprofits, right?
And I think what's also interesting for us is while we haven't dig deeper into the question we just asked, do you also offer donor collaborative supports or DAF? In the next iterations of research, we definitely are planning to do more in-depth solutions. But what's interesting for us when we look at fiscal sponsors and their practices, some are treating funder collaboratives and donor collaboratives almost as a collaborative funds altogether, as a different programming, and other fiscal sponsors just treat it exactly the same as all of the other fiscal sponsorship programs. So it's interesting to see how there's also some of the trends developing around practices of how collaborative funds are operationalized and supported, and are they significantly different from standalone independent programs that are also running through a number of fiscal sponsors too.
Yep. We we see, I'm going to jump around a little bit here as we close. We do see, as I said, more opportunities to kind of improve the sponsor-sponsee relationship, as well as understanding of how many collaborative funds are using this kind of structure to manage what they do. We're really advocating to more BIPOC-led sponsors that are emerging on the landscape, to be the hosts of those funds, which has a great multiplying benefit and impact. We do note that sponsors that do a lot of collaborative fund or DAF management have higher cost recovery rates. They're much more sustainable as a sponsor than those that do not, that are just relying on pure program activity. And that probably shouldn't be surprising, but that sort of heavy presence of philanthropy with a sponsor does have residual benefits for the sponsor and everybody else they support. So that we see as not a drawback, but a benefit. But we do want to kind of improve the acumen around sponsors being able to support this work. Oops. Sorry, I'm going the wrong direction here. Apologies. There was a I want to go back to a question, just touching on this briefly. Again, this is going to be a takeaway for you all, but there was a question around spin out and when to spin out, and that was, I think, one of the questions we haven't directly addressed yet in the presentation. This is really a relationship solution, and despite my comments before, there are some good reasons and moments for being standalone and spinning out if that's really what you desire. But we do see the comprehensive forum as, if everything's going well, a potential forever solution for a lot of these charitable activities, including collaborative funds. We see the choice to spin out really as one of relationship status, relationship management. And so we really feel it's important at the front end of the relationship to be clear about goals and objectives, sponsor and project, and that there be regular check-ins. Spin out is not a purely, and in our experience, not predominantly a financially determined moment. A lot of folks feel that, well, we get to a certain size and the economics don't work and we have to spin out and it's going to be better or cheaper to be alone. We generally find that not to be true. So the reasons projects spin out are often differences in mission, differences in risk appetite, interpersonal or management rifts, things that come up operationally that are not satisfying to the project. These are all familiar items, but those tend to be more the motive than, say, a pure cost efficiency or critical scale threshold. That's even though that's popularly held, that's not generally the case. We've built this little rubric that has kind of 6 key areas that we encourage sponsors and projects, regardless of whether it's an operating project or a collaborative fund, to really assess and be mindful of throughout the relationship. And if too many of these things start to skew negative, it may be time to spin out or find another sponsor. So you don't always have to spin to freestanding status. We find a lot of sponsor projects move from sponsor to sponsor if they need new services or they're unhappy with the relationship. So we can kind of keep this as a takeaway.
Yeah, and often that is just to
Yeah.
add to this. Oftentimes, what we see is that the conversation decision around transition is skewed or resting with couple individuals and personal opinions about the experience. So thinking about those 6 different layers might be helpful and might be giving would give you an opportunity to step outside to just thinking, oh, my costs are too high, right? When I do the work with a number of projects who are considering, should we be standalone or should we be fiscally sponsored? And if we are fiscally sponsored at the moment, do we have a chance to find a better fiscal sponsor, right? In those conversations, we always tend to focus not only about what is being offered, how much does it cost, but also how. Because the piece around, that's where usually the issues arise and breaks the relationship, is usually in some sort of a mistrust or of how things have happened or what has happened in certain instances that really didn't meet your needs and expectations and create this obstacle for the continuing relationship.
Yeah, so we're rounding into the hour. I know I'm watching Isis's comments here, and want to get you out on time. So a couple of questions about directory and just for finding sponsors. We're happy to help with that because we do have a sense of the landscape. As I mentioned in the chat, we're working on a kind of knowledge commons and data warehouse project for the field along with Candid. And in case y'all don't know, I'll just do a quick plug for the fact that Candid is about to issue a new version of its platform in the new year that will allow fiscally sponsored projects to be visible as much as other organizations. So it's going to be a big step forward in gathering data on a field that we really have very little public data on. And that will include tracking more sponsors and being able to find ones that work with government or identify as primarily BIPOC-led, et cetera. So we're moving towards that and realize that's an urgent need, but in the interim, we're happy to help in the way we can.
Thank you so much, Asta, for this amazing presentation. I know folks are likely going to drop soon, so just wanted to say if you could please take 1 minute to fill out this evaluation form that I put in the chat. That helps us as we continue our monthly community session webinars for the Collaboratives community. And Thaddeus, also, you obviously have a wealth of resources and information. So I wanted to give you a final closing moment just to share how can people either get in touch with you or find more resources. Could you put some more links in the chat around how to follow up on different resources? And this webinar recording will be available on our YouTube channel right after, or pretty soon after this. So you all can share this and watch a lot of the detailed information again if you need to.
Great.
Thaddeus and Asta?
Well, thank you all, first of all. This was great. And we not only work primarily with fiscal sponsors and projects. So we are welcome any of you if you represent a collaborative fund. We're happy to work with you on your particular relationship and questions. We also do work directly with philanthropy. So we have an ally membership. We are a Type 1 supporting organization, a 501c3. And we're really the only direct service capacity builder for the fiscal sponsorship field currently. And a lot of our work is one-on-one. So through being a member of ours, you can access our services and advisory support, as well as our tools and templates. And we'll share in the follow-up email, I guess, through Philanthropy Together, sort of links to our ally membership and what that entails. So we're happy to help, whether you're a private foundation or a public charity. We can work with both sides of the equation.
And our presentation has a number of links for additional resources, links to the field scan, as well as other things if you're interested to learn more independently as well.
Yep.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. This was such an informative session. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. I hope you have a wonderful Tuesday. And if you haven't yet, take 1 minute to fill out our quick eval form if you can. I'll put it in the chat again. And if you have other suggestions for topics you'd like to see covered on our collaboratives community sessions, we always welcome those ideas as well. Thank you, everybody. See you
Great.
soon.
Thank you.